In this video, I just wanted to run through the lymphatic system with you again. You have this PowerPoint on Edmodo, so so you have the notes already in your notebooks. But I just wanted to run through some points on it. So the lymphatic system is a second circulatory system that you have in your body. So you've already revised blood and the heart. So this is another way of circulating, getting things around, moving stuff around. It's made up of three parts really that you can see here. It's made up of lymph vessels, which are the tubes, right? The lymph vessels. You can see lymph nodes, where and all a lymph node, just need to think about that they're clusters of lots and lots of white blood cells, and the main function of the lymph nodes would be in an immune response to filter the lymph and to try to kill any bacteria or any foreign bodies. So the lymph has a role in helping to fight that pathogens, and it also has a role in collecting excess tissue fluid really and returning it to your blood, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So lymph nodes, lymph vessels, and lymph. Okay, now lymph is pale, it's white in colour because it doesn't have any red blood cells. So if you look at the exam questions that we'll be doing now during the week, you'll see that the same sort of questions come up all the time in lymph. So being able to know the functions of the lymph and the basic structure, what it's made up of. Okay, so lymph vessel, which is the tube, the lymph itself, the pale liquid, and lymph nodes, which are collected very often in organs like the spleen, and we'll do that in a second. Now, if you look at the diagram here, you can see that the blood is coming in the arteriole. Now, an arteriole is like a subdivision of an artery. So the blood is coming from an artery into arterioles, and it's dividing further then into capillaries. Now, capillaries are very, very narrow. So you imagine blood gushing from an arteriole into a really, really tiny, narrow capillary. Well, the pressure is huge in that capillary, and what happens is the blood physically can't fit. So some of the plasma, the water, the liquidy part of your blood gets squashed out. Now, can you see there that you have those cells? So imagine that's a lump of muscle or something. So you have loads and loads, millions of little cells there inside in a lump of muscle, and the capillaries are trying to get in between each individual cell to supply glucose and oxygen. And while the blood is being forced from the arteriole into the capillary, the liquid part is being squashed out. Now, it's only the plasma really and dissolved substances in the plasma that will be squashed out. Red blood cells, platelets, too big. White blood cells, lymphocytes get pushed out as well actually into the tissue fluid. So tissue fluid is extracellular fluid. Extra means outside. So it's the liquid that surrounds your cells. Now, if you didn't take that liquid away, then your tissue would swell up completely. Can you see on the right hand side of the diagram where you have white arrows going back into the capillary on the venous end and the venual end? So you can see that 90% of the tissue fluid goes back into the blood capillary at the venous end, and it goes back into the blood that way. But 10% of the tissue fluid actually gets absorbed by the lymph and goes into your lymph, and once it's in your lymph vessel, you call this liquid lymph. Okay, now sometimes the exam questions will ask you give differences between lymph and blood. So the colour is the first thing. Okay, why isn't lymph red? Because there's no red blood cells, no hemoglobin, no platelets, no clotting proteins, nothing like that. Okay, you would have some small proteins in lymph, all right, but they would be things like hormones, antibodies. Nothing big would be able to fit through the wall of the capillary. Okay, so that's the one of the functions, if you like, of lymph, that it returns tissue fluid to the blood. Now, the 10% of the tissue fluid that goes into your lymph goes right up. Do you see it going up there? And it returns it to the blood into the subclavian vein, which is at the base of your neck. So like I've said, it's a secondary transport system, and the main function is to return tissue fluid into the blood, back into the blood. And where does it return it into it? The subclavian vein. And you can read through that yourselves. That's basically what I was going through there. Now, you can see collections of nodes as well in particular glands. So they kind of cluster together. The lymph nodes cluster together in glands, like a few examples. So your spleen, you can see there your tonsils, your adenoid, your thymus, those kind of glands under your armpits, There where you'd have a lot of lymph nodes. Okay, I've mentioned all of that, so you can read through that yourself. Oh, the one thing I didn't mention there on the last slide was the movement of lymph. Look, how is lymph moved? Similar enough to the way that blood is moved in your veins. The skeletal muscle contracting, okay, so general body movement. So when your skeletal muscle contracts, it squirts, it pushes the lymph along, and the actual lymph vessel itself, there's some contractile muscle there which contracts and pushes the lymph along. And also remember that lymph have valves, lymph vessels have valves, so that the valves stop the backflow of the lymph then along in its movement. Okay, now the next one there, then you can see there that I talked to you there about where you have swellings, where you have large numbers of white blood cells in the lymph nodes. So think of things like tonsils, adenoids, under your armpits. And the function there now is the immunity function. So filtering the lymph, so removing any bacteria, and you have a lot of lymphocytes there. Remember, lymphocytes, large nucleus, producing antibodies, and that's how they kill the pathogens. Now, talking about lymph returning to your bloodstream, we talked earlier about it going into the subclavian vein, but there are two main lymph vessels, okay? You have the thoracic duct on the left side of your body that enters into the left subclavian vein, and then the right lymphatic duct collects lymph around the right hand side of your body, and that enters into the right subclavian vein. There's the swelling, look, that you can see when the lymph isn't actually, or when the tissue fluid isn't collected, and there you can see lymph and blood vessels. So just to kind of recap on the functions of the lymphatic system, the one big one is that it returns tissue fluid to your bloodstream. So remember, 10% of the tissue fluid doesn't go into the capillaries on the venual side of the tissue, and that 10% has to be returned to the blood by the into the subclavian vein base of your neck. Second function is in immunity, so defends the body against infection. Lot of lymphocytes in lymph, and that they'll filter the lymph and they'll kill any pathogens that might be present. And the last function of lymph, of course, we mentioned when we were doing the digestive system. Remember, we talked about fatty acids and glycerol not being able to enter the blood plasma because they're not water soluble. So remember, we talked about them going into the lymph, reforming and being coated with a layer of protein, and then those fats go back into your bloodstream in the subclavian vein. So that's another function. So be very clear with the three functions: immunity, defending against infection, collecting tissue fluid, and transporting fats. So definitions: lymph, clear liquid, because again, no red blood cells. Okay, lymph vessels and lymph nodes are small organs where you have an awful lot of white blood cells. And remember, you have clusters of lymph nodes and glands like your tonsils, your spleen, your adenoids, and under your armpits. Okay, so don't like some people think, oh my God, I don't know what lymph is about. It's quite short, actually, the chapter. So just use the exam questions now that I give you and try to summarize the notes. Okay.